So Fisheries and Oceans Canada is the federal department responsible for the control and management of aquatic invasive species. Prior to the AAS regulations coming into force, there were some gaps. There was a sort of a patchwork of federal and provincial legislation. And the problems were that they had different language, they had different prohibitions, and they had different levels of risk tolerance. Some jurisdictions didn't have any legislation at all, while others were fairly well protected. So the AAS regulations provide a national standard of protection against aquatic invasive species. The intention is for them to provide a suite of enabling regulatory tools for federal, provincial, and territorial ministers, depending on who manages the fishery in a particular area. So the regulations establish two types of prohibitions, those that are specific to a list of species, and then a general prohibition against unauthorized introductions. The first type is against importation, possession, transportation, and release, and there is a list of species in Part 2 to the schedule. It includes the name of the species, which prohibitions apply, and the geographic area in which they apply. The second type of prohibition is a general one against the introduction of non-Indigenous species into all bodies of water unless authorized under federal or provincial law. So of particular interest to British Columbia, there are 4 species of Asian carp, the grass, bighead, silver, and black, which are prohibited from import, possession, transport, and release in Canada unless dead and eviscerated, as well as zebra and quagga mussels that are prohibited from import across Canada and in possession, transport, and release live or dead in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So there are exemptions to the prohibitions within the regulations. So for example, for scientific, educational, or aquatic invasive species control purposes. And in these cases, risks have to be mitigated. Another exemption is with respect to possession, transport, and release that apply to ballast or biofouling of large vessels, and that's because there's already legislation that exists under Transport Canada. And then a third exemption is provided for the use of deleterious substances in aquaculture facilities regulated under the Aquaculture Activity Regulations. So in addition to Part 2 to the schedule, there's also a list of controlled species in Part 3 of the schedule. The 14 species are not prohibited, but are subject to control activities where they are not Indigenous and where they may cause harm. So in terms of enforcement, fishery officers and fishery guardians can take measures to control species listed in Parts 2 and 3 of the schedule. So they can notify the public that species are not Indigenous, they can enforce the prohibitions, and that is in addition to powers already granted to them in the Fisheries Act for search and seizure, for example. Direct people to cease an activity that may lead to an introduction of an aquatic invasive that's not Indigenous. Direct people to restrict an activity or an access to a place. For example, a marina owner could be asked to restrict access to the marina because an aquatic invasive species has been determined to be in existence. So prevention, as you know, is really the key to dealing with aquatic invasive species. Everybody plays a role in preventing the introduction and spread of AIS, whether they be fishers, recreational boaters, or cottage owners. And education and public awareness are crucial in ensuring that the regulations reach their intent. Since 2013, we've really focused on what the roles and responsibilities are associated with managing reports of aquatic invasive species. And so it used to be that when somebody called our toll-free number, it would go through to a science staff member who was not necessarily in the office if he happened to be off working in the field or something like that, which is obviously not the most ideal situation. So now, when somebody calls our toll-free number, it goes through to a conservation and protection radio room, which is answered 24/7. So at least the report is received, and then it's forwarded on to the appropriate people. And we also include in our distribution Matthias Herborg from the province of BC to ensure that the right people have the information.